prepared by the four capable prosecutors are made to stick. It's an international criminal law.
On November 20th, 1945, 20 men descended by elevator from the prison to courtroom 600 of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. They had ruled Europe for 12 years. They had started a war that killed 60 million people and ordered the systematic extermination of another 6 million. That morning they sat on a wooden bench in front of 8 judges from 4 different countries and listened as the charges against them were read. Nothing like this had ever happened before, that the leaders of a state could be publicly tried for crimes committed in the name of that state was an unprecedented idea in international law. Winston Churchill wanted to execute them without trial. Stalin had proposed in Tehran the summary execution of 50,000 German officers. The American judge Robert H. Jackson, who organized the prosecution, insisted on the trial with an argument that shocked half the legal profession. If civilization was incapable of responding to these crimes with the law, it would not survive their repetition. There was a technical problem. There was no prior statute that criminalized the war of aggression or the extermination of a civilian population. Jackson solved it in a radical way. The laws would be created during the trial itself, based on the general principles of international morality. 4 nations would judge on behalf of all humanity. To reach that bench, they first had to be caught, and to catch them, someone had to have the cage ready before the war ended. That someone was Colonel Burton C. Andrus. On October 2nd, 1944, at 10 in the morning, a convoy of American military jeeps entered Mondorf-les-Bains, a village of 1,200 inhabitants in southern Luxembourg, recently liberated by the Allied forces just weeks before. From the lead vehicle descended a cavalry colonel with a bright green helmet, a shade no one had ever seen in the front sections. His name was Burton C. Andrus. He had South American-style mustaches, and his grey eyes were hidden behind thick, dark glasses. In his hand he carried a brochure with 2 names written on it, Hotel International and Hotel Palace. He inspected the first on foot. It was boxed in between old houses that left barely an alley free around the facade. Little visibility, few lines of fire, too many blind spots. He shook his head and returned to the jeep. The small column turned left and advanced along Avenue Marie Adelaide until behind a group of old beeches and a somewhat neglected garden, an imposing ochre-colored 4-story building appeared. It was the Palace, a luxury hotel with 50 rooms, owned by a merchant from Cologne. Andrus circled it on foot, examined it from all angles, calculated distances and fields of vision. He decided in seconds. That visit was not a hotel inspection. It was the founding of the first prison designed to contain the most dangerous men in the world. At that moment, on October 2nd, 1944, the American vanguards had barely passed 45 kilometers beyond the Siegfried Line, the chain of German fortifications running north of Trier. Berlin was more than 600 kilometers away, with dozens of battles and tens of thousands of dead ahead. The war still had 7 months to go, but Colonel Andrus did not wait. He was, according to the American Army's own records, the most stubborn officer in the entire institution. And he had understood before anyone else one thing. If the leaders of the Third Reich were to be tried, the place had to be ready before capturing them, not after. The operation was given the code name Operation Mondorf and was shrouded in the strictest secrecy. The village's name disappeared from writings, newspapers, and military communications. A curfew was imposed throughout the area from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning. Anyone caught with a camera was detained and subjected to a military tribunal. Permanent checkpoints prevented access to any curious onlookers. Mondorf-les-Bains ceased to exist on maps. Its only identity was a military acronym, a PO 513 US Army. Andrus mobilized an entire battalion of the Corps of Engineers. He distributed his men across 4 hotels in the village. He and Company A at the Terminus, Company B at the Grand Cher, C at the Bristol, D at the Windsor. The palace was reserved for the future prisoners, and in it Andrus poured all his meticulousness. The local glazier Sylvain Linster was hired to repair all the windows broken by recent fighting. A group of blacksmiths and masons closed every gap, every vent, every opening with solid iron bars. Around the hotel, a double enclosure of posts and barbed wire was erected. 4 turrets, 2 on the facade and 2 on the flanks, would each house a section of machine guns. The engineers positioned electric spotlights so that the entire building would be permanently bathed in light at night. On the roof, they installed a powerful electric alarm, and finally, so that none of this would be visible from the outside, they covered the posts and wire with camouflage tarpaulins. The work was completed in less than 6 days. Andrus had his prison. But his first prisoner would not arrive until the following spring, and the months of waiting were far from peaceful. The greatest hunt in history. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender in Reims. 3 days later, on May 10th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel repeated the signing in Berlin before the Soviet representatives. The war in Europe was over. The wanted lists prepared by Allied counterintelligence services with photographs and data sheets for each target shifted from being a planning exercise to an active operational order. But 2 of the names destined for the most prominent seats on the future bench no longer existed. Adolf Hitler had died on April 30th, 1945, in the bunker of the Berlin Chancellery. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's Minister of Propaganda, fell the next day along with his wife. The Soviets presented Goebbels's charred body as photographic proof. Hitler's body, however, remained unverifiable for decades. 2 names on the list, however, were already in Allied hands before the war ended. Rudolf Hess, the former number 2 of the Nazi Party, had been a prisoner in Britain for 4 years since his solo flight on May 10, 1941, when he landed in Scotland on what he described as a personal peace mission. When Hitler learned of it, he declared that Hess was insane. The mission was futile. Hess remained in British custody at various facilities until October 8, 1945, when he was flown to Nuremberg. Hans Fritzsche, official commentator for Radio Berlin and a voice recognizable to millions of Germans, surrendered on May 2, 1945, to the headquarters of Marshal Georgy Zhukov to formally offer the city's capitulation. The surrender had already been signed by General Helmuth Weidling, but Fritzsche did not know, or it did not matter. He was sent by plane to the Lubyanka prison in Moscow, where he remained until being transferred to Nuremberg. The others were somewhere in collapsing Germany, mixed with millions of prisoners and displaced persons. Finding a specific individual in that chaos was an extraordinarily difficult undertaking, but the Allied services had been preparing the lists for years, and by the spring of 1945 they had photographs, voice records, detailed physical descriptions, and networks of informants. The first significant capture was Franz von Papen. Von Papen, former Chancellor of Germany between June and November 1932, and one of the conservative politicians who had facilitated Hitler's rise to power, convincing themselves that they could control him, had taken refuge in the Ruhr with his family when the 9th American Army advanced through that region. He chose not the castle of Count Max von Stockhausen, his son-in-law, but a cabin in the middle of the nearby forest. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, an American military police patrol discovered the hideout. A sergeant entered, pistol in hand, and detained everyone present. Von Papen showed his papers. The response was categorical: "Keep them. You are a prisoner like the others." Von Papen protested that he was not a soldier, that he was over 65 years old. "I don't care," the sergeant replied. On May 6th, the French located Baron Constantin von Neurath in their occupation zone. Von Neurath had been the first Nazi foreign minister, a position he held from 1932 to 1938, before being replaced by von Ribbentrop and later protector of the Reich in Bohemia and Moravia, where he oversaw the repression of the Czech resistance. That same May 6th, the Americans found Hans Frank in Berchtesgaden, lost among approximately 2,000 prisoners that officers of the US 7th Army were diligently trying to identify and catalogue. Frank had been the Governor-General of occupied Poland since October 1939, directly responsible for policies that decimated the Jewish and Polish population of the country. His nickname among the resistance was the Executioner of Warsaw. Around 11 at night, Captain Gordon James Broadhead, head of the military administration of the area, was awakened by a telephone call. A man claiming to be Hans Frank had tried to remove himself from the situation. Broadhead intervened personally and organized first aid. Frank survived, but his left hand was left with permanent partial paralysis. The next day, May 7th, a patrol of the 5th American Army found Wilhelm Frick near Munich, who had been the Nazi Minister of the Interior, the man who signed the 1935 Nuremberg laws that stripped German Jews of their citizenship, and later protector of the Reich in Bohemia and Moravia in place of von Neurath himself. A British section captured that same day Fritz Sauckel, the General Plenipotentiary for Labour in Germany, the man who had organised the forced recruitment and deportation of approximately 8 million workers from across occupied Europe to work in Reich factories. And a Royal Canadian Navy coastal patrol boat intercepted Arthur Seyss-Inquart, Reich Commissioner for the Netherlands in the North Sea. He was aboard a torpedo boat attempting to reach Holland and had just met with Dönitz in Flensburg before fleeing. On May 9th, it was Hermann Göring's turn. The Reich Marshal in the Austrian Tyrol had sent ahead his aide, Colonel Bernhard von Brauchitsch, to the positions of the American 36th Division to announce that Göring wished to surrender personally and speak directly with General Eisenhower. The idea was to present himself not as a prisoner but as a political interlocutor. He was convinced that the Americans would need him to negotiate with what remained of Germany, that he had a role to play. He ultimately surrendered to Brigadier General Robert J. Stack in Kitzbühel. What he carried with him was an inventory of the excesses of a life built on plunder, a considerable quantity of narcotics. He had been addicted for years to dihydrocodeine, a synthetic opioid, a toiletry kit with creams and lotions for face and hands, silk pajamas, 4 watches, large rings adorned with rubies, emeralds, and diamonds. A loose emerald he used as a personal amulet, and a gold cigarette case. On his chest, he wore 12 medals, which were removed as soon as he arrived at the Allied base in Kitzbühel. His pistol was also taken. Göring handed it over with a ceremonial gesture, as if he still somehow had the authority to decide when and how to surrender his weapons. On May 10th, it was the turn of Hjalmar Horace Greeley-Schacht, former president of the Reichsbank and former Minister of Economics, the financier who had designed the Reich's covert rearmament mechanism in the 1930s. His capture was, by comparison, almost comical. He was found in a truck traveling with a group of former French political prisoners who had just been liberated from a German detention camp. Former French Council Presidents Édouard Daladier, Léon Blum, and Paul Reynaud shared the vehicle with General Maurice Gamelin and the former Hungarian regent, Admiral Miklos Horthy. Schacht, one of the architects of the Nazi state, came into American hands alongside his own victims. On May 1st, the Soviets had discovered in Berlin the Reich Minister of Economics, Walter Funk, hiding among the staff of the Japanese embassy in the city. Funk, who had replaced Schacht at the Reichsbank in 1939 and had been informed that the precious metals, currency, and other valuables stolen from concentration camp victims were deposited in the bank under his management, hoped that Japanese diplomatic neutrality would protect him. It did not. On May 12th at 11:30 a.m., American Major General Lowell Rooks summoned Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel aboard the former passenger ship Patria, anchored in the Flensburg fjord at the northern tip of Germany. Rooks gave him an hour and a half to prepare. He could bring his personal aid and luggage weighing no more than 150 kilograms in total. Keitel arrived at the Flensburg airfield in his private car, accompanied by German General Dethlefsen. Upon boarding the waiting British military plane, he saluted those present by waving his field marshal's baton, encrusted with jewels. It was the symbol of the highest German military rank. His career as a Wehrmacht officer ended with that gesture. The Worm and his traps. After Keitel's capture, 3 days passed without news. The others seemed to have vanished. On May 15th, the arrests resumed. The first that day was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Main Security Office, the institution encompassing the Gestapo, the SD, the security police, and all the Nazi state's repression and intelligence apparatus. Kaltenbrunner had replaced Reinhard Heydrich after his assassination in Prague in June 1942. He was, in the chain of command of Nazi terror, the man most directly responsible for the operation of the extermination camps after Himmler. He stood nearly 2 meters tall, had a face marked by scars from student duels in Austria, and was, according to historian John Wheeler Bennett, a man with a horse face and the hands of a strangler. Kaltenbrunner had hidden in Alt-Aussee, a small town in the Austrian Salzkammergut, about 40 kilometers from Salzburg, famous before the war for its salt mines and alpine landscape. There, in the Am See Hotel, converted into an SS hospital, he planned to undergo cosmetic surgery to alter his most recognizable features. But at the last moment, fear overtook him. He dreaded being identified on the operating table, unconscious and at the mercy of whoever was performing the surgery. One night he fled into the forest, as von Papen had before him. A local recognized him and reported him to the Allied authorities to gain favor with the occupiers. He was arrested without resistance. That same May 15th, farmers from a village south of Berchtesgaden informed the command of the American 101st Airborne Division that Dr. Robert Ley, head of the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the unified Reich labor union that had forcibly absorbed all independent German unions in 1933, was in an isolated small house. Ley had been one of Hitler's closest circle members throughout the Nazi era, and in his political testament, the Führer had confirmed him as head of the Labour Front. The 101st soldiers found an elderly man sitting on the bed, unshaven, trembling, clad in blue pajamas. "Are you Dr. Ley?" asked the patrol leader. "No, you're mistaken. I am Dr. Ernst Distel." "All right, it's the same. Come with me." At the division command post, the man stubbornly denied it. The Americans, who had been searching for him for months, brought in an almost 80-year-old man named Frank Xavier Schwarz, general treasurer of the National Socialist Party since 1925, who had been detained days earlier. Seeing the man in pajamas, Schwarz could not contain his surprise. "Look, Dr. Ley is here too." The Nazi officials surrendered to the evidence. "They've won," he said grumpily. That same day, in Flensburg, a British search team inspected the German Navy hospital, checking patient by patient. They found in bed with a sprained clavicle the official Nazi philosopher Alfred Rosenberg. Author of The Myth of the 20th Century, the pseudo-philosophical text intended to provide intellectual support for Nazi racial ideology, Rosenberg had also been responsible for the systematic plunder of the artistic and cultural heritage of the occupied Eastern Territories and the main administrative figure of the Soviet-occupied regions. American Army Commander Coogan, in charge of reviewing the confiscated Nazi documents, would later describe him. What we found in his diaries and correspondence was enough on its own to send him to the gallows. It demonstrated his direct responsibility in the massacre of millions of Jews and deportees. The next day, May 16th, in the same Flensburg, the British arrested Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, General Alfred Jodl, and Minister of Armaments Albert Speer. The three had been part of the shadow government cabinet that Dönitz had presided over in the final days of the Reich, holding daily meetings on a ship in the Flensburg fjord without any real power over anything. Dönitz had prepared 12 suitcases for the transfer. He was allowed to take only one. As he was escorted down the street to the vehicle that would take him to the airfield, German soldiers and sailors who saw him pass stood at attention and saluted. Dönitz responded with his head held high. It was the last act of an authority that no longer existed. Almost at the same hour that Kaltenbrunner fell into American hands in Austria, more than 1,000 kilometers to the north on the outskirts of Bremervörde, a routine British patrol stopped an ordinary-looking man with a shaved head and an eye patch at a checkpoint. The man presented documents under the name Heinrich Hitzinger, a security field agent. The name did not appear on any list, but something about the man gave the British officer pause. He was taken in for interrogation. It was Heinrich Himmler. The head of the SS, architect of the Holocaust, the man who had overseen the industrial murder of 6 million Jews and millions of Slavs, Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war and political opponents, had vainly tried to join Dönitz's government at the end of the war. Dönitz rejected him. Himmler had also requested to be named a negotiator with the Allies. He was again rejected. Disguised as a simple soldier, with false papers and a patch covering his left eye, he attempted to cross Allied lines and disappear into post-war Germany. During the interrogation, before the British could extract any valuable information, Himmler bit down on a capsule he had hidden between his molars. The capsule had survived body searches because Himmler had concealed it in a dental cavity specially prepared for it. He died within minutes. His body remained on the floor of the room where he died, in a requisitioned house near Nuremberg, for 2 days. No coffin, no headstone, no name engraved anywhere. He was buried in a shallow grave dug on a wooded hill. None of those present spoke during the burial. When it ended, a British soldier broke the silence with a phrase in English, "Let the worm go to the worms." The hunt continued. 3 important names were still missing: Joachim von Ribbentrop, foreign minister, Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth for a decade, and Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Dönitz's predecessor as head of the Kriegsmarine. Moscow protested the delay. Stalin even formally accused the Anglo-Americans of deliberate sabotage to protect the fugitives. Von Schirach proved the most curious to resolve. He had grown a mustache, obtained false papers under the name Arthur Falk, and had taken refuge in the Tyrolean town of Schwaz, near Innsbruck. He knew some English and offered himself as a volunteer interpreter to the Americans in the area. By day, he worked with them, translating, facilitating communication with the local population. By night, in his room, he wrote his memoirs in a thick diary he had disguised under the title The Secret of Myrna Loy, borrowing the name of the popular American actress. It was a concealment that spoke volumes about his state of mind. Surrounded by Americans, he pretended to be one of them while writing for posterity. But when news arrived that all the Hitler Youth leaders had been arrested and that even young members of the youth had been imprisoned, something broke inside him. He had been the leader. He had given them an ideology, trained them, sent them to die, and now he was hiding. On June 5, 1945, he voluntarily presented himself to the American commander in Tyrol. Von Ribbentrop was betrayed by Champagne. Since April 20, 1945, the former foreign minister had been living on the 5th floor of a modest building in Hamburg under the false name of Riese, in the apartment of a 35-year-old divorced woman whose name is not preserved in the records. He had gone nearly 2 months without being recognized. But in his youth, before entering politics, von Ribbentrop had worked as a sales agent for a wine import company in Germany and Canada, and had also served as a sleeper car attendant. That accumulated knowledge of wine turned out to be the crack in his cover. One day, he entered a tavern and began to speak with such expertise and enthusiasm about French champagne varieties and their methods of production that the owner of the establishment became suspicious and alerted the British police. No one who was merely Riese spoke about wine like that. At dawn on June 14, 1945, 4 soldiers and a British second lieutenant entered the apartment. Von Ribbentrop was wearing red and white striped pajamas. He appeared visibly uncomfortable about the woman's presence during the search. During the frisk, they found a potassium cyanide capsule taped to his abdomen. He also handed over 3 written letters addressed to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Foreign Minister Anthony Eden, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. On the envelope of the letter to Churchill, there was a mistake that British investigators found revealing. The man who had been ambassador in London from 1936 to 1938 and had personally met Churchill on numerous occasions had written Vincent Churchill instead of Winston. The last to be captured was Erich Raeder. The Soviets had protested so much about the delay in locating him that the Anglo-American services began to suspect Moscow was deliberately hiding him to use as a bargaining chip in post-war negotiations. The reality was much more banal. Raeder was living peacefully with his wife in the Soviet sector of Berlin, in his usual home, without disguise, without false papers, and without having moved from where he had always lived. The Soviets had simply not searched for him there. On June 23, 1945, nearly 2 full months after Germany's surrender, 6 Red Army officers arrived at his house, arrested him, and deported him along with his wife to Moscow, where he was held in isolation in a prison for 15 days before eventually being transferred to Nuremberg. The palace that became a cage. The airfield of the capital of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg was becoming increasingly busy. Allied planes arrived and departed night and day. On Saturday, May 12th, Field Marshal Keitel arrived. The first of all had been Arthur Seyss-Inquart, transferred directly from Flensburg. And then, over the following weeks, one, by car or truck, always escorted by jeeps with machine guns mounted on the sides, all the captured leaders travelled the narrow, winding road leading to Mondorf-les-Bains. In the destroyed Europe, that hotel was an anomaly that unsettled those who knew it. It had electric light, hot and cold running water, functioning elevators, white tablecloths on the tables, sheets and pajamas changed daily, lamps on the nightstands, and a tree-lined park for walking. Captain Medical Officer Clint L. Miller had set up consulting rooms equipped for emergency surgical procedures. Nowhere else in Luxembourg was there a comparable medical facility. The prisoners were regularly visited by doctors and subjected to multiple interrogations. But in the intervals, any outside observer could have mistaken it for a spa. The guests were called Mr. by the American soldiers. They ate on the ground floor in a large dining room served by 6 German waiters in white jackets: Josef Jakisch, Theodor Kemmer, Wilhelm Gierlich, Josef Meyer, Otto Henke and Bernhard Janssen, all prisoners of war selected by Colonel Andrus for their reliability. In the 4 turrets, machine guns were loaded. At night, the spotlights continuously illuminated every corner of the garden and the entire facade of the palace. And the double enclosure of barbed wire covered with camouflage tarpaulins remained in place, invisible from the street. Goering, who arrived on May 21st, was assigned the largest room in the building on the 3rd floor. The 6 German waiters lived directly on the floor above. "We sleep above the government," they remarked to each other with genuine irony. Dönitz had a room adjacent to Goering's. Von Ribbentrop had a very small room on the top floor. The only one who did not live with the others was Franz von Papen, housed for reasons Colonel Andrus never explained at the Hemmeridinger Hotel, some distance from the palace. Each prisoner had a personal guard who followed him discreetly. Goering's was a sergeant of Greek origin whom everyone called Phil. The Reich Marshal was immediately subjected to a rigorous detoxification from opioids. He had been taking massive doses of dihydrocodeine for years, a synthetic painkiller initially prescribed after he was seriously wounded in 1923 during the failed Munich beer hall putsch, and his dependence had grown to consuming 20 pills or more per day. In a few weeks, he lost a noticeable amount of weight and regained agility. He began smoking thick wolf cigars made in Hamburg, which he frequently gave to his guard, Phil. During a routine inspection of his room, a potassium cyanide capsule was discovered and confiscated. Andrus knew the marshal had more hidden somewhere on his person or in the room. He never managed to find them all. Life at the palace was governed by a code of bells installed in the ceilings of hallways and rooms. 1 bell in the morning to get up, 2 for personal hygiene, 3 to go down to breakfast on the ground floor. At noon and in the evening, 2 bells to prepare, 3 to go down to the dining room. 1 long, sustained bell after nightfall was the curfew signal. All room lights had to be turned off, while the exterior spotlights were switched to maximum. The prisoners took long walks through the park during the permitted hours, naturally grouping by affinities or the need not to be alone. Goering, increasingly thin and lucid as the detox progressed, smoked and did not hide his irritation. "I do not understand why I am kept here when there is so much to do in Germany." Dönitz protested that they wanted to try him simply for having assumed the head of state at the moment of collapse, when no one else wanted to shoulder that responsibility. Von Ribbentrop, Baldur von Schirach and others discussed animatedly, sometimes even laughing, while the Americans watched without intervening. Hjalmar Schacht, the banker with the highest IQ in the group, 143 points according to tests administered during his detention, refused to mingle with most of his companions. He distinguished between those he considered gentlemen, such as von Papen and von Neurath, with whom he wanted to associate, and the rest, whom he bluntly described as criminals. He tried to have as little contact as possible with the majority group. On July 28, 1945, during a violent storm that shook Mondorf-les-Bains, Goering began sweating profusely and fainted in his room. His pulse was barely perceptible. The doctor, called urgently, thought for a moment that the marshal could die right there. The accelerated detox had deeply weakened a body that had relied on opiates for years to function. Goering recovered after several injections. The doctor reduced his daily cigar ration from 20 to 12 and prescribed rest. On August 10th, the news of Hiroshima arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Owen personally delivered it to Goering. The marshal's first reaction was categorical. "I don't believe it." The officer handed him a copy of the Stars and Stripes newspaper with the details of the bombing. Goering read silently and murmured, "It's formidable, but I don't want to get involved in these problems. I'm about to disappear from this world." Dönitz, who was listening to the conversation, commented that Germany had also worked on the atomic problem but lacked the necessary materials, and added that he shuddered to think that the Americans could have dropped that bomb on Germany. Von Ribbentrop, also present, said, "It's a revolution. Now no one will be foolish enough to start another war." Then Dönitz took the newspaper and read it aloud in English for those who did not understand the language. The others listened in silence. 2 days later, the group of detainees went out to the balconies and terraces of the palace, bare-chested, to sunbathe like any other afternoon. Within a few weeks, all of them had tanned skin. None of them seemed to understand or want to understand what was being prepared 350 kilometers away. The traumatizing fall from a power intended to last 1,000 years to a hotel prison had not in the slightest softened the character of these men. Field Marshals Keitel, Jodl, and other senior military officers filed formal complaints to Colonel Andrus because they considered it beneath them to personally clean their own cells. They appealed to the Geneva Convention. Andrus replied in writing, reminding them that a group of American officers held prisoner in Nazi camps had simply requested to be executed rather than tortured, and that the camp commander had responded with a single order: "Whips! More whips!" Keitel, in particular, seemed to have forgotten that when it was pointed out to him that his orders to execute escaped British pilots violated international law, his response had been, "I spit on it." The Europe these men had built was collapsing around them, and they were asking for clean sheets. Those who broke before it even began. Not all the leaders arrived at the dock intact. The American commander of the 101st Airborne Division, General Blitt, was driving around the outskirts of Berchtesgaden when he had to stop on a road where an elderly man was painting with his palette and easel. The commander greeted him. The man with the long white beard returned the greeting, but something about that face looked familiar. He had seen that photograph in every Allied office. "You look like Julius Streicher, you know," Blitt said suddenly. The old man turned pale. "Do you know me?" Streicher was arrested right there. He asked for permission to change his shoes before leaving. He was the man who for decades had run the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, the one who had published caricatures of Jews devouring Christian children on the front page, the one who had incited systematic extermination from the printed pages with a consistency that even his own followers found embarrassing. Removed from his post as Gauleiter of Franconia in 1940 for corruption scandals and depraved conduct that Hitler himself deemed unacceptable, he had spent the final years of the war on his Pleikoshof estate, painting watercolors and writing memoirs that no one would publish. That is where they found him. The case of Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the King of Steel and Cannons, was different. Chief American prosecutor Robert Jackson had demanded from the start that a representative of German heavy industry be brought to the dock. Krupp was the obvious choice. His company had manufactured the Kaiser's cannons in the First World War, had partly financed the rise of Nazism, and during the Second World War, his factories operated with tens of thousands of forced laborers from concentration camps, including prisoners from Auschwitz transferred specifically to work at his Essen facilities. Jackson described the growth of the Krupp empire to the court with precise figures. In 1935, the company's net assets were 57 million marks. By 1941, they had risen to 111 million. The value of its factories, calculated at 76 million in 1937, reached 237 million in 1943. It was the enrichment of someone who had bet on the right regime at the right moment. But Krupp was not in a condition to hear these figures. In 1944, he had suffered a stroke that paralyzed half his body. In November of that year, in the park of his Blunbach castle in Austria, he fell. The car speeding him to the clinic braked sharply to avoid a collision, and Krupp hit his forehead and nose against an iron bar inside the vehicle. From that moment, his condition deteriorated. 6 Allied doctors, 1 British, 1 American, 1 French, and 3 Soviet, went in the summer of 1945 to examine him at the hotel where his wife Bertha had him confined. They found a man pale as parchment, almost skin and bones, with sunken eyes. He could only articulate a guttural "Guten Tag," and when something annoyed him, a murmured "Donnerwetter." He could not sit up or get out of bed. He endured all examinations passively without speaking a word. The doctors signed a unanimous certificate. Gustav Krupp would never appear before any tribunal. The court president, Lord Geoffrey Lawrence, read aloud in the courtroom a document found in the file, a letter dated July 24, 1942, from Krupp to Hitler, in which the King of Steel informed the Führer that the famous Gustav cannon had passed all tests and could be used in the siege of Leningrad. The courtroom listened in silence. Then Lawrence closed the folder and moved on to other matters of the day. French prosecutor Charles Dubost then proposed a solution that produced one of the few scenes of involuntary humor in the trial. Could the court try instead of Gustave Krupp, his son Alfred Jr.? Judge Henri Donnedieu de Vabre, the French representative on the tribunal, slammed his black-covered notebook shut and turned to his compatriot. "Did you really, Mr. Dubost, intend to suggest to the court that one name be substituted for another in the indictment?" Dubost blushed. "Truly, we thought—" Lawrence interrupted him with a single word. "Thank you." The trial's forensic doctor, Captain Najib Clan of Cambridge, would not examine Krupp's brain. He would, however, examine another. On the night of October 25, 1945, Robert Ley hanged himself in his cell. Ley was the head of the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the unified trade union that the regime had created on May 2, 1933, the day after the Gestapo occupied the headquarters of all independent German unions and arrested their leaders. On that same day, he had proclaimed to German workers that their institutions were sacred to the National Socialists and that no one would take from them what they had. 24 hours later, he was the one who had taken everything. On that same day in May 1933, while the radio broadcast the Grand Labor Day ceremony at the Tempelhof airfield with 1 million attendees, the SS were already occupying union offices across the country. The decree establishing the Labour Front, a body that forcibly grouped workers, employees and employers under party control, was published 3 days later. Ley became one of the most powerful men in Germany. He was a stutterer. According to the trial psychiatrist, Dr. Douglas M. Kelly of San Francisco, the defect stemmed from an aviation accident in 1917 on the Western Front, when Ley fractured his skull in a plane crash. When he regained consciousness, he could only pronounce sentences with enormous effort. He discovered that drinking a little made the stutter tend to disappear. He had been drinking ever since, and everything, whiskey, kirsch, wine, in quantities his own comrades considered excessive. His nickname in party circles was the Drunk of the Reich. He had been captured on May 16th in a chalet at Obersalzberg, south of Berchtesgaden. He had been under close watch for days because he had already tried to remove himself from the equation, but the capsule was found by a prison nurse. On the night of October 25th, in Block C of the Nuremberg prison where the accused had already been transferred, he silently tore his underwear under the sheets. He tied a piece of towel around his neck and attached it to the pipe of the toilet cistern. It was small enough to do it with almost no space. There was no sound, no moan. A guard looking through the peephole found him already lifeless. According to the guard who entered the cell that night, the towel had been prepared with methodical precision that contradicted the public image of a man always out of control. "Small enough to do it," said the guard. If he had been larger, he would have had difficulties. On the table lay 2 letters. In the first he wrote, "I cannot bear this shame any longer. I lack nothing materially. The food is good, the Americans are correct and partly friendly. I have reading material and can write what I want. I receive paper and pencil. They do more than necessary for my health, and I can even have tobacco. I can take a daily walk of at least 20 minutes, but what I cannot bear is being considered a criminal." In the second, a kind of political testament, he wrote, "I am one of those responsible for the crimes committed by the Nazis. Having been with Hitler when fortune smiled upon him, I do not want to abandon my leader in disgrace. God has guided all my actions. He raised me up and now lets me fall." 3 hours after his death, Ley's brain was extracted by Captain Clan and flown to Washington for study. Colonel Andrus ordered absolute silence, but the news reached all the cells before dawn. Goering's reaction was immediate. Praise God, that drunk discredited us all. He was the 4th leader to remove himself from the equation, after Hitler, Goebbels and Himmler. Andrus took it as a personal failure. Since being tasked with running the Nuremberg prison, he had been obsessed with security. He had ensured that the accused, barring unforeseen illness, would appear in court. Ley was the first crack in that guarantee. He would not be the last. The Nuremberg cage. At the end of August 1945, Andrus went to inspect Nuremberg. He toured the new prison adjacent to the Palace of Justice, which in a few weeks would receive its prisoners. The work had been carried out in record time by 2 young officers, Lieutenant Dan Kiley, an architect from New Hampshire, and Captain John O. Vonetes from New York. In July 1945, someone had told them with all the informality in the world, "You have to do in 1 month the work of 6, preparing the prison and the Palace of Justice for the biggest trial of the century. Do it however you want, ask for whatever you need, but the work must be finished by the first days of October." Kiley and Vonetes felt their hair stand on end. Kiley had at his disposal an American battalion from the Corps of Engineers, 100 civilian workers, and 400 prisoners of war. His men had to repair 650 rooms on the 3 floors of the eastern wing of the palace and completely rebuild the western part, destroyed by incendiary bombs. The entire first floor had to be transformed into an American-style cafeteria capable of serving 500 people. On the second floor, a large common room for journalists from all over the world and other small offices with hundreds of telephones and loudspeakers. On the third floor, the courtroom, enlarged to accommodate 4 judges and 4 substitutes, 22 prosecutors, 22 defendants, 8 interpreters, 8 secretaries, 60 lawyers and advisors, 250 journalists and photographers, and 150 members of the public. Kiley knocked down walls, built balconies, installed elevators, reconstructed staircases, set up air conditioning, and the first simultaneous translation devices in 4 languages ever used in a court. He brought in technicians from IBM by plane from New York. In just over 40 days, he spent nearly $1 million. The list of materials was impressive: 130,000 kilos of cement, 100,000 bricks, 20,000 roof tiles, 8,000 kilos of plaster, 1,500 kilos of nails, 4,500 square meters of glass, 10,000 fluorescent tubes, and 335,000 meters of electrical cable. He inspected everything. When he finished, he made a single observation: "I want the door and window frames to be varnished black, like hearses." When he returned and saw that the order had been fulfilled, he said with satisfaction, "Now I can come with my prisoners." The transfer from Mondorf took place throughout October. The men arrived from different internment camps across the Allied zone. In Nuremberg, the rules were different from those of the palace. The defendants could only speak during interrogations. The cell lights remained on all night. They would sleep on their backs with their hands on the blankets, visible at all times. The rule was that inmates had to lie in a way that showed their faces directly to the guard. When asleep, they turned their bodies. The soldier's arm would return them to the correct position. Sometimes they were shouted at to do it themselves. The guard shifts, several throughout the night, were very noisy and usually woke them up. The result was invariable. In the morning, they were exhausted and had difficulty concentrating. After Lay's fall, the measures were tightened even further. A guard was permanently stationed at each door, ordered to enter within seconds if necessary. Strict checks were conducted around the building. Attempts at rescue by fanatical Nazis who could still be active in the area were feared. Each defendant had their own defense attorney, who could be chosen from a list or proposed by the defendant themselves. The tribunal wanted to avoid any criticism about the fairness of the trial and accepted practically all proposed lawyers, even some with known Nazi convictions. The defense complained from the beginning about the inequality of resources. They had no assistants, no files, no office supplies, no private offices. 22 lawyers shared a large room with a single telephone in a long corridor. The prosecution had spent years preparing its files. The defense had weeks. Goering chose Dr. Otto Stamer as his defense attorney, a small, nervous and aggressive man who was also tasked with presenting a defense motion to invalidate the trial as a whole. Alongside him, Dr. Robert Servatius, defender of Sauckel, a giant with light hair who years later would defend Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Dönitz chose the German Navy judge Otto Kranzbühler, who appeared before the tribunal in German naval officer uniform and constructed one of the most technically solid defenses of the trial. On November 20th, 1945, at 10:15 a.m., on a cold and grey morning with the poplars and birches bent by the north wind in front of the Palace of Justice, the International Military Tribunal opened Hall 600 for the first day of sessions. The hall was T-shaped with a slight slope similar to a cinema. At the widest part, the walls were covered with dark oak panels with bas-reliefs of biblical scenes: the tree of sin, Adam and Eve, the serpent in the earthly paradise, Cain and Abel. On the left wall, the defendant's bench, with 2 long wooden benches, one higher than the other. In front of that bench, the lawyers' tables, and in the center, the platform reserved for witnesses and prosecutors. The judge's dais was very high, with wide seats similar to those in church choirs, crowned by a group of flags. The stenographers were at the lower part. The interpreters' glass booths were in the corners. The hall could hold 500 people, and that first morning it was full. They entered 3 at a time via the elevator that connected the prison directly with the hall. Keitel, 63 years old, in a green uniform without insignia. Von Papen, 65, hair slicked back, handkerchief in the breast pocket. Goering passed quickly before the others, entered the bench with a determined look, and sat at the far left, next to the microphone. For 218 days he would not leave that seat. Next to him, Rudolf Hess, in a tweed suit and a book of Bavarian stories in his hands. When he arrived in Nuremberg, Hess had claimed to have lost his memory. Prosecutor Amen had tried to get Goering to speak during an interrogation to provoke some reaction. Goering entered the room, listed all his titles: Reich Marshal, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Minister of the Interior of Prussia, and Hess responded to everything that he was sorry but could not remember. Days later, when the possibility of being declared unfit for trial loomed over him, Hess spoke for himself. "From now on, my memory is also available to others. The reasons for the alleged memory loss were tactical." The prosecutors noted it silently. Then von Ribbentrop, prematurely aged. Kaltenbrunner, extremely thin, who, when he first entered the hall, produced, according to psychologist Gilbert, a cold wave on the bench, as if a cold current had entered through the open door. His companions received him coldly and tried to ignore him. He was Himmler's replacement, the man no one wanted next to them because his presence would make the extermination of the Jews inevitable in the attention of the room. Alfred Rosenberg, silent and distant. Hans Frank, in black, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. The butcher of Warsaw had converted to Catholicism during his detention and considered the trial, according to Gilbert, a divine judgment. Wilhelm Frick, stunned and nervous. Julius Streicher, in a plaid sports-cut suit and bow tie, who from the first day denounced that the prosecution had denied him the right to an anti-Semitic defense lawyer. In the second row, Karl Dönitz, with a prominent chin and a turkey-like neck. Erich Raeder, impassive. Baldur von Schirach, with the face of a child who had grown up too quickly. Fritz Saukel, thick-set and bald. Alfred Jodl, very pale. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, glasses on his aquiline nose. Albert Speer, 40 years old, the youngest of Hitler's ministers, who from the beginning adopted a strategy of distancing himself from the regime, which also distanced him from his bench companions. Goering considered him a traitor. Konstantin von Neurath, the oldest, 72 years old. Hans Fritzsche, with a persistent tick at the corner of his mouth. One of the seats would remain empty. Robert Leys. When the defendants were asked to respond to the charges, Goering tried to give a speech before answering. The tribunal interrupted him. He had to plead guilty or not guilty. Not guilty, he then said emphatically, and added, with respect to the charges. It was, as Jackson's son would observe, a first indication of his ability to say what he wanted instead of answering questions. The others followed. Keitel stated that he could answer with a clear conscience before God and history. Von Papen declared that he in no way considered himself guilty. None pleaded guilty. They all knew they would be convicted and all wanted to defend themselves anyway. The judicial psychologist, Gustav Gilbert, with free access to the cells, began systematically recording what the defendants said to each other during trial breaks. His diary, first published in 1947 under the title Nuremberg Diary, remains one of the most important first-hand accounts of the psychological behavior of the defendants during the trial. What Gilbert described were not monsters incapable of reasoning. They were men of measured and recorded intelligence. Schacht led the list with 143 points. Goering and Dönitz shared 138. Seyss-Inquart reached 141, and the lowest was Streicher with 106, who had run a continental machine of destruction and who now refused to accept that it had anything to do with them. What united them, above their differences and mutual grudges, was one thing: the shared conviction, expressed in different ways and with different nuances, that it was not their fault, that it had been Hitler, that they had obeyed orders, that they did not know, that others knew but they did not. Goering's strategy was the boldest. He took responsibility for everything the government has done, but for nothing that was a crime. Speer's strategy was the most calculated. He assumed general responsibility for the slave labor program that he himself had managed as Minister of Armaments, but denied personal guilt, implicated Sauckel, and presented to the court the unproven story that at the end of the war he had even wanted to kill Hitler. Goering did not forgive him. We should never have trusted him. From the bench, the old comrades looked at each other as what they now were, rivals in a competition whose prize was life, or at least the years they had left of it. The 1st of October, the sentences. The 150 accredited journalists had sent in more than 14 million words over 218 days. They had processed 2,630 prosecution documents and 2,700 defense documents in the hall. Witnesses had testified, describing to the tribunal facts that the human mind resisted processing as real. On January 3, 1946, a witness named Otto Ohlendorf appeared before the tribunal. Psychologist Gilbert, who observed him from the bench, later described that the defendant seemed paralyzed when that German officer spoke. Gilbert had simply asked him what he had done during the war. Ohlendorf replied that in 1941 he had led Operational Group D. How many people had his group killed? 90,000 men, women and children in a single year. The Einsatzgruppen, 4 operational groups that followed German troops in the occupied Eastern Territories, had gathered Jews and others considered undesirable, gypsies, political commissars, psychiatric hospital patients, and murdered them in open fields. Goering, while Ohlendorf spoke, whispered to his neighbor, "What does that pig expect to gain?" "He will be hanged anyway," he added, but his gaze was no longer the same as before. On November 29, 1945, in one of the earliest sessions, the prosecution projected document 2430PS on a giant screen, a certified 1-hour film about the Nazi concentration camps. The images had been filmed by Allied cameramen at the moment of liberation. The defendants, who until then had maintained expressions of defiance or calculated indifference, saw the images and some wept. Psychologist Gilbert turned and asked Goering, Dönitz and Hess directly if no one had known anything. Goering replied, "Well, you know how it is. Those at the top don't hear much." The next day, as if the night had served to recalibrate his position, he again pretended to read a book during the sessions, visibly yawning and making sarcastic, low-voiced comments to Hess and von Ribbentrop. At the witness stand on March 13, 1946, it was Goering's turn. He had waited 4 months for that moment. He had overcome his opiate addiction, regained weight and clarity, and entered the stand with the same energy that, according to the press, recalled the agitator who had seized power alongside Hitler in the 1920s. His appearance was spectacular. Slicked back, with a proud head and defiant gaze, he steered the sessions as he wished. He knew English, but Prosecutor Jackson did not understand German. While having the questions translated, Goering considered his answers, which made him seem agile and confident. Jackson had to wait patiently, something his professional life in first-instance courts in his country had not accustomed him to. In a scene that became famous, Goering managed to make Jackson lose patience and throw the headphones onto the table. Desperate, Jackson even considered withdrawing from the trial. The English prosecution convinced him not to. Even French judge Donadieu de Vabre privately acknowledged that Goering possessed a certain distinction. Speer's lawyer, his mortal enemy on the bench, could not help exclaiming that Goering is a real man, a true killer. Baldur von Schirach, who publicly repented of his Nazi past in Nuremberg, admitted, "Now I understand why he was so popular." But documents were documents. You could not cross-examine a document. Jackson's son summarized his father's strategy. The ministry files, the stenographic minutes of Hitler's meetings with his generals, Jodel's diaries found behind a false wall in a Rhineland castle, the foreign ministry archives discovered in a Marburg salt mine, the execution orders signed by Kaltenbrunner that investigators found scattered on the floor in Gestapo offices, all carried signatures, all carried dates, all carried names. Commander Coogan of the American Army, who had examined more than 100,000 documents to select the 4,000 most relevant, later reduced to 2,000 due to the trial's time constraints, described the discovery of the complete collection of Alfred Rosenberg's diaries and correspondence. What we found was enough by itself to send him to the gallows. It demonstrated his direct responsibility in the slaughter of millions of Jews and deportees. After 218 days of sessions, the 8 judges of the International Military Tribunal retired to deliberate for 4 weeks. The core of the prosecution, the charge of conspiracy, was of particular concern to the Americans. Could a dull subordinate like Keitel, whose nickname on the bench was Lackey, be considered an infamous conspirator? The French judges rejected both the death penalty and acquittal in certain cases. The Soviet judges were convinced that all defendants without exception deserved death. The deliberations were tense. Some verdicts were decided quickly. Others generated controversy that the judges removed from the official record. On October 1, 1946, the world turned its attention back to Nuremberg. The defendants entered the hall one by one. Cameras had been banned by that point, although photographers had recorded the entire trial for months. Radio reporters and print journalists were present. Before learning their sentences on August 31st, the tribunal had given the defendants the opportunity to speak last words. Most claimed to have acted in good faith or to have followed orders. Goering revealed to the forensic psychologist what would also be the content of his fall note. "I did not want to provoke a war. I did everything possible in negotiations to avoid it. When it broke out, I did everything possible to secure victory. I was wrong. I was not able to prevent what should have been prevented. That is my fault." Keitel said it was tragic to have to recognize that the best I had to offer as a soldier, obedience and loyalty, was used for unrecognizable purposes, and that not having seen that the fulfillment of a soldier's duty has a limit was his fate. Speer noted that the world will learn from these events not only to hate dictatorship as a form of government, but to fear it. The tribunal called them in order. Goering was first, based on the charges for which he was found guilty: death by hanging; Rudolf Hess, life imprisonment; Joachim von Ribbentrop, death by hanging; Wilhelm Keitel, death by hanging; Ernst Kaltenbrunner, death by hanging; Alfred Rosenberg, death by hanging; Hans Frank, death by hanging; Wilhelm Frick, death by hanging; Julius Streicher, death by hanging; Fritz Saukel, death by hanging; Alfred Jodl, death by hanging. Martin Bormann, whose whereabouts remained a mystery, though later evidence would confirm he had died in Berlin in May 1945, sentenced to death in absentia. Baldur von Schirach and Albert Speer, 20 years in prison; Karl Dönitz, 10 years in prison; Erich Raeder, life imprisonment; Walter Funk, life imprisonment; Konstantin von Neurath, 15 years in prison; Franz von Papen, acquitted; Hjalmar Schacht, acquitted; Hans Fritzsche, acquitted. The 3 appeared relieved before the press. Judge Jackson, who had not even considered the possibility of acquittals, received it as an unexpected shock. 12 of the convicted would ascend the scaffold. The executions were scheduled for the night of October 15th to 16th, 1946. The night of the hangings. The Allies had debated for months about the best way to carry out the sentences. They had wavered between the gallows and the guillotine. The Soviets, accustomed to their own procedures, in the war crimes trials held in the USSR since 1943, condemned prisoners were hanged before massive crowds just minutes after the sentence was read, were not willing to delay the executions for long. The back and forth over appeal deadlines lasted until early September 1946, when a compromise was reached. 4 days to file an appeal before the Allied Control Council, which was not a judicial body but a political one. Great Britain had already ordered that no sentence reductions be granted. This order came from the Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and naturally it was enforced. The appeals were rejected. The man in charge of carrying out the sentences was Sergeant John C. Woods. He was short but stocky. He had lied to the army to obtain the job, pretending to be an experienced executioner, although before 1944 he had no real experience. In fact, at 18 he had joined the US Navy, but he had been discharged as unfit with a diagnosis of psychopathic inferiority. He rejoined the army years later, silencing his past. He had hanged about 34 American soldiers during 1944 and 1945 and had been involved in 11 other hangings. That was his resume when he faced the Nuremberg executions. He had been chosen over Albert Pierrepoint, his famous British colleague, who came from a family of executioners. His father and uncle had performed the same profession, and whose efficiency was legendary. Andrus, without checking Woods's service record, preferred him. Woods had his own concerns. He had not been able to measure the height of the condemned, nor know their exact weight, nor assess their build. With the exception of Goering, none were particularly heavy, and even the Reich Marshal had lost a lot of weight in captivity. He had relied on the photographs provided to him and a brief visit to the tribunal hall. He trusted the Italian hemp ropes from the Edgington Company, official execution suppliers for the United Kingdom, which had been sent from England. They were strong, 3 meters long. The calfskin covering favored the sliding of the knot. Handcrafted, each rope took almost a week to make. That, at least, reassured him. In the days leading up to the execution, he practiced at the Palace of Justice gym, almost obsessively repeating the gallows mechanisms with 90-kilogram sandbags. Each night, he was returned to his barracks at the Firth airfield, where he stayed under discreet but effective security measures. It is believed that on 2 occasions he was nearly killed, once by poisoning after some executions at Dachau, and another time in a shooting in Paris. In both cases, it was assumed that members of the Werewolf, the clandestine Nazi resistance movement, were responsible. The metallic sounds of hammers, saws, and nails carried from the yard to the cells of the condemned. In Julius Streicher's cell, they were the loudest. Streicher asked the prison barber, a German named Hermann Wittkamp, "Will they finish building our gallows soon? Listen, I will climb the steps bravely. I already have my last words planned." The Control Council had authorized the presence of 45 people at the execution. To the delegates of the 4 powers, the Soviet Molotov and 3 Western generals, were added 8 journalists from the 450 accredited photographers, doctors, and Allied officials, and 2 German politicians serving the occupying powers, prosecutor Friedrich Leisner and the president of Bavaria, Wilhelm Högner. These 2 accompanied Colonel Andrus to notify the condemned one by one that their requests for clemency had been denied. The first was Streicher, who merely mumbled, visibly annoyed, "I knew it already." Although the authorities had determined that the condemned should be unaware of the exact date of their execution, somehow they all knew. Their activities on the last day, October 15, 1946, gave it away. Goering remained lying on his cot with a Fontaine novel instead of taking his usual walks in the yard. Von Ribbentrop spent the day writing letters and reading Gustav Freytag. Rosenberg preferred Rudolf G. Binding. Jodl immersed himself in reading Knut Hamsun, the Norwegian Nobel laureate who had publicly supported Hitler. Keitel read stories by Paul Alverdes. Streicher read Der Soldat by Mirko Jelusich. Frick read Hannibal, also by Jelusich. Sokol entertained himself with the youth of great Germans in history. Seyss-Inquart read Conversations with Goethe by J.P. Eckermann. Hans Frank gathered part of the German prison staff and spoke to them about the wonders of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, then read aloud poetry by Ludwig Thoma and spent the rest of the day writing letters. Alongside Kaltenbrunner and Seyss-Inquart, he attended Mass, confessed, and received communion. At 3:30 in the afternoon on October 15th, Goering was writing a letter. It was not the one that would later be published as his death note. It was another found undated among his belongings, in which he wrote, "I find it in extremely poor taste to display our deaths as if they were a spectacle for journalists, photographers, and sensationalism-hungry onlookers. I will die without all that sensation and publicity. Let me repeat once more that I feel no moral or other obligation to submit to the death sentence or execution of my enemies and those of Germany. What I am going to do, I will do with joy, and I consider death a liberation." And he signed it, Hermann Goering. The Nuremberg prison was reinforced with tanks and anti-aircraft guns. Until the last day, Andrus was obsessed with the possibility of an attack by fanatical Nazis attempting to free the condemned. The 11 who remained, Goering would be the 12th before his turn, were watched minute by minute. They slept on their backs, hands visible under permanent light. Goering had formally requested to be shot instead of hanged. It was a soldier's death, he argued. The request was denied. Months earlier, Goering had established a relationship of trust with an American guard named Tex Willis. According to later investigation, in exchange for a signed photograph, Willis had reportedly removed certain objects from Goering's briefcase without properly recording them. The investigation never reached a definitive conclusion. What is certain is that a cyanide capsule remained hidden for months in the Reich Marshal's cell without any inspection detecting it. After the executions, when Colonel Andrus ordered a thorough search of all the condemned's cells, he found a small arsenal that had gone unnoticed. A steel screw in von Neurath's cell, a glass bottle in von Ribbentrop's, a safety pin, 4 metal nuts, 2 small pieces of iron, and a sharp steel strip in Keitel's, a 1-meter rope in Schacht's, a 30-centimeter wire in Jodel's. Dönitz had tied 5 shoelaces. Even Saukel had a spoon with sharpened edges. On the afternoon of October 15th, shortly before 10 at night, the prison doctor, Dr. Flücker, visited Göring as he usually did. They spoke in low voices for about 3 minutes. Flücker handed him something that Göring placed in his mouth, then he checked his pulse and shook his hand. Göring lay down on his cot. He remained completely still for 15 minutes, facing the wall with his eyes covered by his hands. At 10:44 p.m. on October 15th, he extended both arms to the sides of his body. Seconds later, he clenched his teeth so hard that a crack of crystals was heard, followed by a convulsion that shook his entire body. The guard sounded the alarm. When the officers arrived, the doctor and the chaplain had already certified his death. Hermann Göring, the star of the trial, had gotten his way. In his death note, he wrote, "I did not want to provoke a war. I did everything possible in negotiations to avoid it. When it broke out, I did everything possible to secure victory. I was wrong. I was not able to prevent what should have been prevented. That is my fault." And in the letter he had written that afternoon, not intended for posterity but for the present, he made clear that there was no guilt, only a final, deliberate refusal to die on the stage others had prepared for him. The fall of the Reich Marshal dominated international headlines even before the executions began. Morning newspapers already carried war-type headlines. Göring's body was taken to the execution room along with the others. After 12:07 a.m. on October 16, 1946, Sergeant Woods and his assistant ascended the gallows platform. The gymnasium of the Palace of Justice, a 10 by 24-meter room, plastered walls riddled with cracks, smelling of coffee, whiskey, and American blonde tobacco, housed 3 black-painted wooden gallows. The platform was 2.5 meters high. 2 gallows would be used alternately. The third remained in reserve. The witnesses, semi-hidden in the darkness, were barely visible to the prisoners. Each rope was used only once. The prisoners disappeared from view when the trapdoor opened, and it was there that the struggle between man and death occurred. The condemned would be executed one by one, but the authorities did not want the ceremony to last too long, so the military police called the next prisoner while the previous one still hung. Radio journalist Arthur Gaith was one of the few authorized witnesses and described what he saw in a live broadcast for American stations. "I was an eyewitness to the wilted and rotten flower of Nazism." Von Ribbentrop took Göring's place. He was the first to ascend. He entered the gym with a stoic expression, barely moved his head to see the 3 gallows, and kept his gaze forward on the way to the scaffold. They had to ask his name twice before he responded audibly. On the platform before the hood was placed, he spoke his last words in German, "God protect Germany. My final wish is that Germany finds its being and that understanding is reached between East and West. I wish peace in the world." His handcuffs were replaced with a leather strap to prevent him from bringing his hands to his throat as the rope broke his neck. His body fell swiftly through the trapdoor without a sound. Von Ribbentrop died at 1:29 a.m. Ribbentrop still hung from the rope. Only 2 minutes had passed since his execution when Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was brought into the room. He appeared less tense than Ribbentrop, though he maintained his characteristic upright head on the way to the scaffold. From the top of the platform, he observed those present with caricatured Prussian arrogance. Loud and clear, he recalled his sons who had died in combat. "I pray to Almighty God to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers have died fighting for the fatherland before me. Now I follow my sons, all for Germany, Germany above all." The trapdoor opened on platform number 2 at 1:33 a.m. The execution suffered a brief delay because Keitel and Ribbentrop still hung, and the witnesses were allowed to smoke. 2 doctors, one American and one Soviet, certified the death of the first executed. Kaltenbrunner went next. He walked determinedly to the gallows, moistening his lips repeatedly. On the platform, he faced a Catholic chaplain of the American Army. "I have loved my German people and my homeland with all my heart," he said. "I have fulfilled my duty according to the laws of my people and regret that in these times my people were led by those who were not soldiers and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge." He ascended the steps deeply troubled, visibly pale. His last words, as the rope was adjusted, "Good luck, Germany." The trapdoor opened at 1:39 a.m. Alfred Rosenberg was completely calm when he entered the gym. He even seemed bored. He refused to speak when asked. Although accompanied by a Protestant pastor, he answered negatively when the pastor asked if he wanted to pray. Moments before the executioner placed the hood on his head, he looked at the pastor without saying anything. It was the fastest execution of the night. Hans Frank smiled slightly, though he swallowed frequently. Having converted to Catholicism in prison, he considered his execution an act of atonement. In a very low voice, he spoke his last words. "I am grateful for the kind treatment I have received during my captivity, and I pray to God to receive me into his mercy." As the hood was placed over his head, he was seen swallowing again. When Wilhelm Frick entered the room, it was already 2:05 a.m. He was restless, though not fearful. He tripped on the last step. When the hood was placed over his head, he simply said, "Long live eternal Germany." Julius Streicher did not hesitate to confront his executioners. When brought before the scaffold and staring at the group of witnesses, he bellowed, "Heil Hitler!" When asked his name, he replied contemptuously, "You know very well my name?" The interpreter repeated the question. Streicher answered again, "Julius Streicher." As he climbed the steps, he murmured, "Now I go with God." On the platform, he turned to the witnesses and shouted his last cry, "Purim Fest 1946. He was bidding farewell to the world with the anti-Semitic creed he had maintained throughout his career. Purim is a Jewish festival celebrating the survival of the Jewish people against the extermination planned by Haman in the 5th century BCE. When the trapdoor opened, Streicher kicked with all his strength. The gasps of his agony could be heard for a while until the executioner had to descend to the area below. It was the longest death of the night. Fritz Sauckel maintained until the last moment that his sentence was due to a translation error. His last words were, "God protect Germany and make it great again. Long live Germany. God protect my family." Sauckel also struggled for a long time. The knot had not tightened properly, and for a few moments a muffled groan was clearly audible. Alfred Jodl was visibly nervous with a gaunt face and dry mouth. He ascended the steps to the gallows with some difficulty. Once there, he spoke his last words in a steady voice. "I salute you, my Germany." The last to ascend the steps was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, assisted by the guards due to difficulties walking caused by his deformed foot. A man of great intelligence, he had not doubted that he would be condemned to death and had preferred to face the trial with loyalty to the cause he had defended all his life. He had not renounced Hitler for a moment. In a firm, though low voice, he spoke his last words. "I hope this execution is the final act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson learned in this war is that there must be peace and understanding among peoples." It was 2:45 a.m. on October 16, 1946. With each trapdoor that fell, the night advanced over Nuremberg. The bodies were photographed. That same night, they were transported to Munich in military trucks. Before dawn on October 16, 1946, the remains of the 12 condemned, including Goering's, were cremated. The ashes were scattered in the Isar River near Munich so that there would be no place that could become a site of pilgrimage. There would be no graves, there would be no monuments, there would be no point on the map to venerate what they had represented. Many years later, in the final hours of January 31, 1977, an old US Army colonel suddenly sat up in his deathbed and, with wide-open eyes and a gaze lost in the distance, exclaimed in distress, "I have to get to Goering's cell. He's killed himself." Colonel Burton C. Andrus died shortly afterward. Goering had haunted him to the very end. The survivors. Those sentenced to prison were transferred to Spandau Prison in the British sector of Berlin. Albert Speer served his full 20-year sentence and was released in 1966, publishing memoirs that portrayed him as a technocrat who refused to see what was happening around him. The Nuremberg Criminal Court in the Federal Republic of Germany would review this characterization years later. Baldur von Schirach also served his 20 years. Karl Dönitz was released in 1956 after serving his 10-year sentence. Erich Raeder, sentenced to life imprisonment, was released on health grounds in 1955 at the age of 79. Walter Funk, also serving a life sentence, was released in 1957. Rudolf Hess, the only life-sentenced prisoner who was not released early, remained in Spandau for many years as its sole inmate until 1987, when he died at 93 under circumstances that were never fully clarified. He suffered from such severe arthritis that he could barely walk. His final decades in Spandau were spent in a cell within a building designed for 400 men. Franz von Papen, Hjalmar Schacht, and Hans Fritzsche were acquitted at Nuremberg, although all three were later tried by German denazification courts and sentenced to various penalties. Von Papen died in 1969. Schacht lived until 1970 and returned to work as a private banker. Fritzsche died in 1953. General Telford Taylor, who had been part of the American prosecution team, organized 12 additional trials in Nuremberg in the following years, the so-called subsequent Nuremberg Trials, against doctors who performed human experiments, judges who applied racial laws, generals responsible for massacres of civilians, industrialists who used slave labor, and SS officials directly involved in the operation of extermination camps. The main trial, however, had established something that international law had never so clearly affirmed before, that the leaders of a state could be personally tried for crimes committed on behalf of that state. That obedience to orders was not a sufficient defense. That aggressive war was, in itself, a crime. The Nuremberg sentences were incorporated into the United Nations Charter. The International Criminal Court, founded in The Hague in 2002, is the direct heir to that legal logic.